Anyway, today what we'll be doing is I'll be giving you guys a brief overview into what deep learning is, why we need it. I'm not going to be doing too much technical detail. I'm not going to go into the math of it. Well, a little bit, but not a lot. So this will just be an overview of why the term deep came from, and what kind of structure is required compared to like the artificial neural networks that I talked about last time I was here. And I'll also give you a fairly surface level overview of a particular type of neural network called autoencoders, and a variation on that called variational autoencoders. Before we start, I know a lot of you emailed us to work with us at the UH DICE lab for undergraduate research purposes. So Dr. Eick, and Dr. Nuhad Risk, we talked it over. So we'll be sending everyone who emailed us, we'll be sending everyone an online Teams meeting invite, and we'll be talking about it November 19th. So this next week, Tuesday. And we'll be talking about what you might end up doing, what your interests are, things like that. So your group project, I started grading it. It's from what I've looked at it, nobody did anything badly. It's all good, and your grades will be up within a week or so. Task 6 is already out. You might have seen that already. It is dependent on autoencoders, which is what I'll be talking about today, and which is what you should. For task 6, we are just giving you a Jupyter notebook that has an autoencoder within it. So all you need to do is modify some lines, like a couple of lines here and there, and we just want you to go through it, to run that Jupyter notebook and see what kind of results you're getting, and whether they're better than what's in the notebook, or whether you've made it worse or better. And that's pretty much what we want you to do. So today's talk, like I said, it's not going to be super technical, but I will be giving you some brief overview of deep learning, why we need it, what kind of structure is needed for a deep learning network, and then we're going to be moving into autoencoders. If we have time, I'll talk about denoising, sparse, and contractive autoencoders, which are particular structure of autoencoders, so that you know what they look like in practice. And then I'll go into variational autoencoders and why we need variational autoencoders, and what is the difference between them and standard autoencoders. Okay, so now that the setup is out of the way, let's move into the lecture proper. So I took this from an NVIDIA blog, like that's almost 10 years old now, 2016. But this is a really good surface level overview. Like I talked about when I gave you guys the artificial neural network lecture, I talked about how neural networks came from just after the World War, like just post 1945. A lot of these initial developments into neurons and neural networks and such came in. It is only when computational power overcame the algorithmic power that we started getting what's called machine learning, where we are not just running statistical models, but we are running black boxes. And then eventually in the 2010s, when computing power became functionally unlimited, and we managed to make networks as big or as deep as we could, we moved into what's now called deep learning. So what is, in a sense, artificial intelligence? So artificial intelligence is a very broad term, because there's no whatever we call AI, whether it's a large language model or whatever it is, it encompasses way too many things to be dialed down into like one particular algorithm or one particular model. So broadly, AI is just the ability of a computer, of a computing device of any kind, to perform tasks that we assume that only humans can perform. Right. That's a very broad overview of what's called AI, in at least in computer science terms, if not in science fiction terms. Machine learning are algorithms that learn from examples. So we take neural networks, and those neural networks are not trained because we already understand whatever we are trying to, like whatever physical process we are trying to model. We may not understand that process all that much, but we have examples. Like if these things are if these are the causes and these are the effects. So if we know those two parts, then we move into what's called machine learning as opposed to simple statistical learning. And then finally, deep learning is a specialization of machine learning where we get a much broader idea of what those causes are. So if there's a cause and an effect, how are those causes represented, like in a more abstract way? So we learn data embeddings, we learn data representations, and because it's called deep because there are multiple layers of learning, and as those layers go deeper and deeper, we gain more and more understanding of those causes, so that we are much better able to identify and understand the effects, essentially. So this is very interesting because this is essentially the entire timeline of modern deep learning, right? Okay, you can ignore the Aristotle part, but the rest of it, the Machalopate's neuron model, the Hebbian learning network, the Rosenblatt's perceptrons, these are all. These are the people who started and created what we today know as modern deep learning structures. You might recognize some of these names pop up over and over again. John Hopfield, Yann LeCun, Geoffrey Hinton. You can see a lot of stuff from Geoffrey Hinton. Ian Goodfellow, who is basically behind all the generative models that you see these days. You might have also heard of Hopfield and Hinton because this is the year they won the Physics Nobel Prize, which some people don't agree with, but they are very fundamental, like Geoffrey Hinton and John Hopfield. They are fundamental to the entire discovery of modern deep learning, modern machine learning, large language models. None of this would have existed if it hadn't been for the foundational work of Geoffrey Hinton, Yann LeCun, John Hopfield, Ian Goodfellow, and a lot of other people. So now that we know this, let's move on to the problems that that led to the emergence of deep learning, right? So one of the biggest problems is, and Dr. Eick has talked about this in your lectures before, is called the no free lunch theorem. That is, you cannot have a single model that works for every single possible problem that you throw at it. Like during the Renaissance period, you would have polymaths who would do everything, who would sculpt, who would create art, who would create machines, who would break the foundations of mathematics in those days. But that kind of polymath performance is not possible. So what happens is that, like in general, what you can say, what happens is that if you take a single model that can do every single thing that you throw at it, then the performance of that model would just be a complete average. It wouldn't be better than any other model that you can create, right? So if you flatten out a model for you use a large language model, for example, to create images, to create weather, to analyze weather data, to analyze medical images, to analyze to check for anomalies in your credit card account, then again, the performance will keep going down until it becomes a complete average, so that it's not performing better than any other model out there. So that's called the free lunch theorem, the no free lunch theorem. That we have to, we cannot completely generalize. We have to specialize. So we have to take some assumptions in order to focus our performance to get good models, and that's where the focusing of deep learning came from. So I talked about this in my last lecture, the universal approximation theorem that was proposed earlier, but was proven in the late 80s and generalized for a lot of performance in the 1990s. Does anyone remember what the universal approximation theorem is? It's very descriptive. The name tells you what it does. Can anyone guess what it means by a universal approximation theorem? Okay, moving on. What it means is that a neural network even a single layer neural network can, in principle, uh, approximate any function, essentially. No matter how complicated the input function that you give it, uh, in principle, a single layer neural network can learn anything you throw at it. You make it extremely wide, and you give it enough input data, and it will learn everything. This is the very basics of universal approximation theorem, and this is why neural networks are so powerful, because in principle, no matter how much you cut it off, it can learn anything. And this is true for it. This was proven in the 90s, when there was a big boost in understanding neural networks, which then died out in the later 90s, but again rose back up in the mid 2000s. Is that no matter what nonlinear activation function you use, like ReLU units, rectified linear units, which are super common these days, uh, it's true for them. It's true for all of these nonlinear activation functions that given a sufficiently wide neural network, it can approximate any input data that you throw at it. So, well, if that's the case, why do we need deep learning? Like, why do we need bigger networks at all? Right? If a shallow network can solve this for us, um, based on the universal approximation theorem, that it could, like, shallow networks, like one hidden layer networks, can perform as good as any deep learning network, any LLM, any ChatGPT model you can throw at it. But that's not true. It does not. They usually, their performance isn't, even though theoretically they should, practically they do not. So why is that? Lots of possible answers. Maybe uh, the shallow network needs a lot more neurons than a deeper one, so that we reach diminishing returns. At some point, no matter how many neurons we throw at it, the universe, while the universal approximation theorem holds true, in practical purposes, we can't really get to any degree of accuracy with the shallow network. Another big problem is that our algorithms, which you and I are working on it, and perhaps in the future you and I would be developing more algorithms for this, are not designed to work with this kind of like shallow one hidden layer neural networks. So there might be lots of different reasons for it. The minima, the solution that you're looking for, might be in very odd places. It might not just be a smooth Euclidean plane with a single minima. There might be horseshoe shapes. There might be shapes where it might be much harder to get to that minima. The convergence rate, that is how quickly we get to this optimal solution, might be too slow. It might be exponentially slow, perhaps. And finally, one of the bigger reasons is that the type of problems that we're trying to solve, for example, object recognition, which is when you take a photo in your cell phone and your cell phone identifies everything in it for you. This kind of problem might not be a problem that can be solved, that doesn't fit very well with shallow architectures, right? It might it just might need deeper layers of architectures to understand what are the things within it. And that's why a shallow architecture does not fit, despite theoretically it should fitting. So maybe one of these is true, but the unfortunate answer is that we don't really know. We don't really know why deep networks perform much better than shallow networks. Right. There are counterfactuals to this. There are some problems where you can reduce the problems into P space in P versus NP. You can reduce problems into P space, and then you'll see that suddenly a shallow networks starts working much better. Uh, there is evidence from this previous slide for A and C. There's a lot of like real world evidence, like where deep architectures move much quickly through the solution space, and are much more efficient, both time wise, space wise, and processor requirement wise. And obviously, if we can reduce the number of neurons within the network, the training converges much faster. So There is evidence from real world work, real world research for A and C being true, but there's also evidence for B being true and A and C being untrue. Right. We so one of the things you'll find out when you are doing your autoencoder task is that machine learning models tend to plateau at a level. They get stuck at some point. They reach a maximum accuracy level, and then they get stuck there. So this seems very obvious. You'll see this in your autoencoders. You have seen this in your neural network task. Everyone who has worked in neural networks has seen this, but we don't know why that happens. Like we don't know a general solution or a general answer for why that happens. Why that performance plateaus. Like it used to be like a known thing that this would happen because of minimas, like minimas or maximas, whatever your optimization point is. But the current thinking, like in 2022, 2023, is that this is not always the case. It's not just because you're stuck in a minima and you're unable to escape it. That's why your performance is plateauing. Because sometimes even when the performance plateaus, the gradients, the difference between your input and your output continues to stay large. So this is a very basic question about deep networks. Why do deep learning networks plateau at certain levels? But we don't even know this. So like this is why deep learning is such a modern subfield, and this is why there's so much research going on, because a lot of these fundamental questions are still unanswered. So it requires people like you and me to investigate, to perform empirical analysis to find out why that is. So, um, you might have heard like of the terms of machine learning versus the deep learning. So what is the fundamental difference between these two terms? Now that you know that what deep means is multiple layers, but machine learning also has multiple layers. So what is the fundamental difference? Well, machine learning requires, in general cases, machine learning requires human design feature representation. So humans classify, humans supervise the input data. Humans understand what the input data means, and then those features are what the computer, what your learning algorithm tries to optimize for. So it requires machine learning in general requires a little bit of understanding of what your input data is, right? And deep learning, on the other hand, it learns those representations on its own, right? That's why you have these multiple thousands upon thousands, maybe not thousands, but like hundreds upon hundreds of layers, because they extract meaning from abstract knowledge, right? Even they extract patterns, they extract uh, relationships between patterns much better than even with humans sometimes. Not always, but sometimes. So this is the fundamental requirement for deep learning, right? So uh, the biggest breakthrough for deep learning came in the 2010s with Ian Goodfellow and Jan LeCun, is that image processing and textual processing, so natural language processing, became much more powerful than traditional statistical learning using deep learning networks. So if you look at something like BERT or many of these other deep learning models, and you look at their performance versus older, more statistical methods from the late 2000s, you will see the massive gap in performance essentially. And it's much deep learning training a deep learning model is much easier. Like I said, you don't need to understand the input data. You don't need to embed. You don't need to embed your features perfectly accurately within your model. Uh, you don't need to understand what exactly maps from the input to the output. Those deep net layers understand that for you, and the performance is obviously much better. But the drawback to this is that because it learns these features on its own, the amount of training data required is very high, which is why when people are training modern sequential networks or modern LLMs, they some the to create a good LLM, you pretty much have to scour the entire internet and put it into your model. because otherwise they are not able to understand, they're not able to model the data correctly. And like I said, it started with image recognition and natural language processing and translation purposes. So for speech. So that has fallen behind somewhat because of other purposes. So to give you an example of what the results of a classic machine learning model versus modern deep learning model looks like, let's see. So you give a picture that's slightly unconventional, right? These are not three things that come together very often. So you give that to a traditional machine learning model, and that traditional machine learning model knows what cats are, knows what wine glasses are, and things like that. So it would be able to, with some level of accuracy, with some level of confidence, it'll be able to tell you, okay, there's definitely a cat in there, and there's also probably a wine glass in there, but it's not certain because those are two things that generally don't come together. But for a deep learning, which has no initial assumptions, a proper deep learning model has no initial assumptions for the data at all. So it learns it much, 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 much better. And it can give you a natural language synthesis of the text itself looking like this, right? Like a description that a human would give. But we must be careful here that we don't ascribe what a human would see in any photo to what a machine would see. You can, the machine is able to understand this because these are still contextually correct things, right? Like this cat looks like a cat. Wine glass looks like a wine glass. This bouquet of flowers looks like a bouquet of flowers. But if you start twisting these up, if you start introducing features that are very difficult to understand and very difficult to see, a deep learning model would perform slightly better than machine learning model in recognizing those, but they don't. Humans are still going to be much better because pattern recognition, the human mind pattern recognition, not just humans in multiple animals as well, is still to this date much more powerful than machine learning based pattern recognition. It's getting closer. We're trying to solve that problem, but it's not yet. To give you an example, okay, again, these are images that are, so a proper cat is very easy to understand. You dress up the cat like a nun, it gets tough. A deep learning model would be able to guess, but again, it would be confused. Give it something like completely out of left field, a human is able to tell what that rat is dressed up as, right? But a machine learning network, a very modern machine learning network might be able to guess somewhat, but in general, a machine learning network is not going to be able to solve this. But for a human, for us, it's very intuitive. We know what we are looking at as soon as we look at it, right? We don't have to do. We are not stuck in a boot loop in our mind trying to understand what's going on here. We can immediately see and we can immediately get. So that's the ultimate goal for deep learning and image recognition, to be able to look at an image, no matter how wild it is, and have a guess of what it means. Well, okay. Now that we know what deep learning models are trying to do, how are deep learning models organized? Okay, so the fundamental unit behind a deep learning model is something called a tensor. Right, you'll see that when you use, say, for example, Google Cloud Learning, it sometimes gives you the option of using TPUs versus GPUs versus CPUs, right? Tensor processing units, graphics processing units, central processing units. Tensors are very important because they're a way of storing data that is very optimized for training machine learning models. That's why you'll find in modern graphics cards, they have entire storage locations and entire processing units that are dedicated to processing tensors, right? And what are tensors? Tensors are very simple. They're just matrices, right? A one-dimensional tensor is just a vector. It's just a list, essentially. A two-dimensional tensor is a matrix. And as we go up in dimensions, it's just matrices layered behind each other, right? That's all that tensors are. So the biggest challenge with working with tensors is that for machine learning, you need to modify those tensors, right? You need to rotate them so that operations are performed in the correct order. You need to change the shapes because sometimes you just need column. Sometimes you go column by column. Sometimes you go row by row. Sometimes you just need, say, for example, every third matrix in this tensor array. So that's pretty much what the biggest challenge is with tensors. They're very simple data structures, but you'll be doing so much modifications when you're doing more complicated machine learning stuff that understanding how the tensor is structured becomes very important, because otherwise you're going to get confused in your head. The other thing is obviously for a lot of learning models, you'll see that they do the simple training validation testing split instead of any others you may have learned. Because of how large this data usually machine learning data is. So when you perform, for example, ablation studies, where you change up certain parts of the algorithm to see how the model is performing, it becomes very difficult to do any other kind of split other than train test validation splits because of the huge size of the data. Also, we generally use mini batches. You'll see that when you run a pre-trained neural network, or when you use PyTorch or any JAX or any of them to learn to run neural networks, to learn deep learning models, you'll see that they use mini batches. Those mini batches are optimized so that each of them can run on a TPU at the same time. So if you correctly design your batches, if you correctly design your mini batches, your model just performs much better because it's much more parallelizable if you correctly set up your neural network. So this is the structure of a very basic deep learning network. This has been reduced to its components. So this is all there is, right? In the real world, obviously, this is going to be much bigger. But like I said, this has been reduced to its fundamental components. This is what a deep neural network structure looks like, right? You have the data transformation layers. You have both outside weights where you can weigh certain representations more than the others if you want. You have the inbuilt weights, which are obviously optimized, which are obviously created through your loss functions. And then you have your predictions and then your true targets, right? So this is similar to the artificial neural networks that you have studied, but it is just much bigger. There are more layers, the weights are bigger, everything is just deeper and bigger. That's all there is to it. I use this image because deep learning is inherently a layered architecture. So you're layering lots and lots and lots and lots of different kinds of input and activation functions, convolutional networks, densely connected networks, many different layers of all these things. And that's why and each of these layers understand a little bit more of the input data versus the output data. So this is how it works. And all of these combined create your deep learning model. So this is how the input transforms into the prediction. And once that prediction is done, it is compared to the real world input, and then it goes into the loss functions to check how much it has diverged from the real world data. Then an optimizer model sends it, updates the weights of the neural network, and then the neural network runs again. So it's a cyclical situation, just like the standard neural networks. All of this to say that if you understand what a basic artificial neural network is, you understand what a deep learning network is, right? They're the same structure. It's just bigger. That's all there is to it. And some stuff changes. So how do you? So depending upon your errors, depending upon your input versus output, what are you trying to optimize? So there might be different kinds of metrics that you try to optimize for once you reach a certain level of accuracy. So are you trying to optimize for understanding one particular information much more than, like, from your input data set, you are much more sensitive in some cases to false negatives in medical information. So false negatives or false positives, you are much more sensitive to that. So your metric would have to care for that. So you don't really care whether there's more of your true positives, but you care a lot more about your false negatives. So again, these are things you have to look into your data and you have to think about what you care about out of the model, and that's what you have to optimize. And how does this optimization work? Well, there are like lots and lots of different methods, and there are more methods coming out every year. So SGD, momentum method, NAND method, ADA grad, ADA delta, RMS prop. So these are all really good, and well, they're not modern anymore, but they used to be really modern loss functions that you use. And this optimization, like I said earlier, is not a solved problem, right? Your input, your model is going to plateau at some point. If your input is if your model is plateauing at 100% accuracy, then something has gone wrong. And if your model is plateauing at anything less than 100% accuracy, then well, we can't really give you a good solution that okay, if you do this, you're guaranteed to improve your performance. You just have to experiment to figure out what's going on there and how to improve it. You have all of you know about supervised learning and unsupervised learning. Supervised learning in machine learning and data deep learning as well. It requires labels, right? It requires understanding of what your input data is. Say, for example, image classification, image segmentation, all these modern image segmentation models start out as supervised learning models, but then they move on to unsupervised zero-shot learners. So unsupervised learning, like I said, relies just on the input data. It works very well on text, right? Because if you have a lot of text, uh, the semantic relationship between words comes out on its own, right? And that's what all these different word embedding types, CBOW, which is continuous bag of words, skipgram, all of these, they figure out what words mean, which words are come next to each other. So this is how large language models perform so well. The thing is, none of these models need to understand what words mean. Like we as humans, we need to understand what a single word means for us to use it in a sentence. These models they don't understand what any words mean. They just model the relationship between words, right? So if two words are come next to each other in like 90% of the scenarios, they're going to attach them to each other in their embeddings, and that's how they learn. That's how they form sentences. That's all there is to it. It's just a stochastic Markov model, right? And what they end up creating are useful embeddings. So if you create like very basic large language models, you will have to figure out an embedding to use anyway, because again, these tensor networks that I showed you earlier, they're numbers, the matrices of numbers. So you need to find some way to convert all your words into numbers, and that's this useful embedding. And yeah, it figures out lots of relationships between words, similarities, dissimilarities, oppositions, etc., etc. And there are like targeted loss functions that work only for textual representations. That well, in 4368, if you do LLMs, we'll teach you about which kind of loss functions to use and what kind of word embeddings to use to create large language models. Okay, so that's it for deep learning. If you have any questions, you can ask me, because next we're going to be moving into autoencoders. Okay, let's move on to autoencoders, right? So go ahead. Thank you for reminding me. Finally, the first time I've taken attendance. Okay, so autoencoders. Well, as the name might suggest, it automatically encodes its input data to its output data. That's the fundamental structure of an autoencoder, right? If you in your AI courses in 4368, you might have learned about diffusion models. Autoencoders are diffusion models came out of the structure for autoencoders. So what it does is it takes an input representation, like an input effect, for example, and it organizes itself in the inside such that it can reproduce that effect on its own. So the model, that the latent space representation that it creates, is able to reconstruct the data to an arbitrary level of accuracy. It is not trying to, it's not trying to like solve a problem for you in a sense, but what it is trying to do is essentially understand the input well enough that it can reconstruct the input on its own. So that is given those multiple hidden layers, H that's within this, that you can see in the gray boxes over there. And if there's an encoding function, f of x, and a decoding function that reconstructs H, right? And well, the thing is, if this autoencoder just just does what I described, like it takes input data and it exactly recreates it as the output, well, then it's not very useful because it's a very obvious thing. You can do that with one neural network, right? Like a single layer neural network where it's positive when the input is positive, it's high when the input is high, and it's low when the input is low. Well, then you have an autoencoder. Well, that's not exactly what it does. Well, autoencoders, what they do is they're unable to learn like exactly what is being provided, right? So it approximates what's inside, and this approximation is stored in that latent space, right? And this, how is this approximation done? Is a process called undercompletion, where it squeezes the input data so that only what is important pops out of it. Right. If you have learned, say, for example, principal component analysis in your statistics classes, it's kind of autoencoders perform a much better variation of PCA, where it takes an input data and it squeezes out whatever is important out of it, and it gives that to you as an output. And because of this property where it takes like a much broader input information and it pairs down anything that is unimportant out of it, it's very useful for learning like properties of the data. So for example, you have a large block of text, right? The standard example that's used for this is a constitution, whether the US Constitution or the Indian Constitution or any other constitution. You give that to an autoencoder, a particular type of autoencoder, and then you ask it questions about like what is important out of it, and it's going to give that to you because it understands, it figures out by its own which parts of this input text is the most important part of it, or what defines the rest of the like the rest of the text. It uses a process called semantic matching, which is, again, this part of it was created by Geoffrey Hinton, who won the Nobel Prize this year. He won the physics Nobel Prize for some odd reason, but this is part of what he created. The semantic matching of autoencoders, right? So just to reiterate the point, this is reiterating what was in the previous slide. They are designed to autoencoders reproduce their input images, but not perfectly. And they do this because how do they do this? They learn an encoding for the input image, and they reconstruct that image through the use of that encoding. I talked about PCA, which is principal component analysis, and SVD, the single value decomposition. So what PCA does, principal component analysis does, is that it takes a large multidimensional data set, like vectors of images, and it creates, it finds those vectors that can approximate the entire data set. So if, for example, you have a satellite taking photos of the surface of the Earth. Now, the satellite takes photos in visible light, in infrared, in ultraviolet, and in much lower and higher spectrums of light than we can see. So what it creates when it takes a photo of the surface of the Earth is a set of images, like a set of layers of like one matrix, one tensor layer would just have the ultraviolet, one tensor layer would have visible light, panchromatic, and then one would have infrared. But from out of that, what like mining corporations and other agricultural people, what they do using that, they run PC on top of it, and they figure out running principal component analysis or single value decompositions through it, is that they figure out what is the most important, what stays common in all these images in some ways. So for example, there's a mining process called kriging, where when it takes this kind of images and it runs this scrying model over these satellite images, and it figures out whether there's iron or bauxite or cobalt or whatever within those just by taking satellite images of a single region. And then they send out people to dig in and make sure that what they've found is correct. There's also another way of doing what autoencoders do. Like these are statistical methods rather than deep neural network methods. Principal component analysis and single value decomposition are Fourier and wavelet compression. So I suppose all of you know Fourier transforms and fast Fourier transforms and anti-Fourier transforms. So this is autoencoders can do Fourier transforms for you. They have to be configured in a certain way, and they won't be 100% accurate, but they're pretty fast and similar to wavelet compressions. So autoencoders can do all of these things. They can learn nonlinear dependencies within the data. They can use recurrent neural networks. They can use convolutional layers, and they can obviously, because of the way it's structured, it can transfer learning from different models into autoencoders. So this is what the structure of an autoencoder is. So these are the hidden layers. You take the input, you use the f of x, that it encodes it into a latent representation, and then you run this decoder function, which is g of f of x, brings this latent representation as close to x as possible, right? And because these are squeezed down, because these are like you don't have like a million different million layer hidden layer, you figure out like what is most important in the input data, and then it comes as close as possible. So let me give you, because we're talking about what the structure is, so let me give you a couple of examples of what applications of autoencoders look like. So like I said earlier, information retrieval is a really good, like autoencoders are a really good solution for information retrieval, right? So this is this paper, this image I've taken from the deep learning book by Ian Goodfellow. Like this, but this image, sorry, this text I've taken from Ian Goodfellow's deep learning book. This book is available online for free of cost to everyone, and it is perhaps the best book for understanding thoroughly, like the math behind deep learning thoroughly. It's just book. I think it's just called deeplearningbook.org or something like that. Ian Goodfellow deep learning. So this is really good. I highly recommend. So what autoencoders can do is information retrieval. So you give with any database, but in this example, the database is text. You give it a query, and it will be able to find out the results of that query based on its understanding of the input data, right? Sometimes text and like lots of other information can't be stored in a database, but something just might be a blob of information. Say, for example, chat information or connection information, radio waves, things like that. Something that's just a lot of data, a lot of noise. But autoencoders can, given that noise, can retrieve information out of that for you. This particular method of applications was created by Jeffrey Hinton. It disappeared for a little bit, but this was actually also very highly used by the US and other intelligence services to figure out information from noise for, I believe it's called signals intelligence. Well, this was a really good application for signals intelligence for lots of other intelligence services. Another thing autoencoders are really good at, and is currently used in your cell phones as well, is for denoising. You will find that most of the denoising processes that are used in fast denoising processes. So in your cell phones that denoise the noisy pixel images that are coming in, they use autoencoders because again, they are super fast. They don't require external training, and the more you use, the more photos you take, the better its denoising performance gets. So, which is why denoising is a really good example usage of autoencoders. This has fallen somewhat out of use these days. But when autoencoders first came out in the 2010s, a big usage of them was image colorization. In this case, it's not very impressive, but image colorization for film images was really good initially. Now there are other networks, other models which does that for you much better than basic autoencoders. But it used to be like colorization of images was a really good use case for initial autoencoder systems. And watermark removal again is a very simple thing to do for an autoencoder because it understands the basic image, and this watermark itself is not part of the image of the structure of the image. So when it reconstructs, when it takes a watermark image and then it reconstructs that image, it is almost certainly going to remove that watermark for you. So again, this has gone, both of these usages have gone slightly out of fashion these days because there are other more targeted models which does that for you. But if you want a quick and dirty application of autoencoders, this is a really good one. So some of the properties and disadvantages of autoencoders is that they're not generalizable. Right? They're not generalized and they're not generalizable. So you can't create an autoencoder that does lots of different things because of inherently it learns to reproduce its input images. So it is only able to compress and reconstruct images that are very similar to what it has been trained on. So you can't create a large general model out of an autoencoder, unfortunately. Also, an autoencoder generally requires some form of super resolution model at its output, because the output of an autoencoder is fairly lossy. It is because it's learning a representation of the input image. That when that representation is decoded back into real images, you are going to have losses. It's going to be look pixelated. It's going to lose a lot of its input information because that information was not encoded in the hidden layer. So it's just gone. But one good thing is that it learns very well from very simple examples. So you take a pre-trained autoencoder and you can fine-tune it using your own images very quickly, very fast, and then it is going to work very well on that type of image, which is why your cell phones used to use autoencoders for a lot of purposes, for like red eye removal, um, for watermark removal, for denoising. Like the more you used your cell phone cameras for these purposes, the better it got, because it would take a general autoencoder model and then it would specialize on your own images. A big problem with the new, like as with every single neural network, but the bigger problem with autoencoders is that it overfits very fast. So you need to be very careful and you need to adjust the hidden layers, the latent representation, so that it's not just doing what I said right at the start of autoencoders, that it is perfectly recreating the input to the output. So you have to solve that. There are methods that I'm going to talk about after this. Bottleneck layer, which undercompletes it. There are denoising layers, there's sparsity, and there are what you call penalties attached to the input model so that it doesn't reconstruct the input model exactly. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I will talk about the bottleneck layer because this is very important. So the bottleneck layers are used in a particular type of autoencoders called undercomplete autoencoders, but every single autoencoder these days is an undercomplete autoencoder. So it tries to do the same thing. It tries to learn a compressed representation of its input data, but it is called undercomplete because it forces this representation to have a much lower dimensionality than the input itself. Right? So this is why I said autoencoders squeeze the input information. Right. This squeezing, what it does is it reduces the dimensionality of the input data, and so it learns the only the essential features. So every single autoencoder that you'll find that is being used is almost certainly going to be an undercomplete autoencoder. If you're using Keras, this is what an autoencoder looks like. You encode the input information and then you decode it. That's just and see how simple it is, right? This is quite possibly the shortest deep learning model you can create. And this is going to work well enough for the traditional uh, input of handwritten images, right? Um, okay, in the interest of time, I'm just going to skip over the three types of autoencoders. So there's denoising, there's sparse, and there's contractive penalty autoencoders, right? I'll make this slide available so that if you want to look at it, you can look at it in more detail. Uh, Basically, what contractive does is it adds a penalty to the input information so that so that your autoencoder doesn't completely recreate your input data. Okay, so we are going to move into this is an implementation of autoencoders using RNNs, which are recurrent neural networks. Pardon the spelling, but yeah. Again, I'm just going to move into what's called variational autoencoders and why we need it. Okay, so one of the things here that you can see in the middle, this blue Z, this is the latent representation of all of the input data, right? So your input information has you guys have just learned clustering. So your input data will have lots and lots of clusters of knowledge, right? So for example, if you're training an autoencoder on text, then all the names and nouns are going to cluster together, all the verbs are going to cluster together. If you have geographic information, then countries are going to cluster together, cities within countries are going to cluster together, but within this latent space, right? That's how a latent representation of data works. So this is how uh, this is how the mean and the deviation is essentially stored in the latent space. So in a variational in a standard autoencoder, these latent spaces, all these clusters are separate because we don't really care about how these clusters are stored within this latent space. All we care about is the output. Is given an image, is your autoencoder able to denoise it? Is it able to remove watermarks or whatever? All you care about is this input to the output matching. How this latent space is being created, how it's being formatted, we don't really care for it. Um, but inside, what it is that these clusters are all separated in arbitrary spaces. I'll show you what it looks like. What a VAE does, a variational autoencoder does, is that it makes these latent spaces, these representations of clusters that are stored in latent spaces, it makes it continuous. And how does it do that? So what it does is instead of like the standard output of an autoencoder, which is a vector or a tensor, a multidimensional tensor, what the encoder here outputs is a vector of means. So the central position of the cluster and a standard deviation, which is how big that cluster is. And the output is a distribution instead of single points of clustering. And then to figure out what your output of this autoencoder is, uh, we take this distribution and we sample from that distribution to figure out what the input is. Now there are multiple. I mean, this sounds very simple, but there are multiple challenges to this that people ended up solving slowly over the years. So you look at this, right? This is very simple. Take the data, encode it. That encoded data is stored in an abstract latent space. Then you decode it and you get your output. That's it. Well, how does it work in a VAE? Is that you encode it and then your latent space isn't just your encoded vector. It has the mu and the sigma. So it has a mean and a standard deviation. And how do we get, like, once you have a mean and a standard deviation, that means you have a distribution of data. And how do we get the output? We don't just decode it. And what the decoding process does is it samples from that distribution. And that sample gives us the output. So this is an example of what it looks like. So you have an output of means and an output of standard deviation, and then you assume that it's a Gaussian distribution with mean 0.1 and standard deviation of 0.2, and then you sample from that, and then you get that. Then you get the output, right? So instead of in a standard autoencoder, this would have been your output, just a single vector, but in a variational autoencoder, you take those two outputs from your encoder, you sample from it, and then you get this particular output. This is the big difference between a variational autoencoder and a standard autoencoder. So why do we do this? Right? This sounds insanely complicated for no good reason. Well, the reason we do this is that like while this mean and standard deviation remain the same given a fixed input, you don't always, given that fixed input, you don't always get the same output, right? So there's no one-to-one relationship anymore. You have introduced like it's no longer stochastic. Sorry, it's no longer deterministic, right? Because you're sampling it, your results are going to be slightly different every single time you run it. And so we solve the big challenge of variational autoencoders, where if you overfit it or if you overtrain it, it's just going to, every time it's just going to reproduce its input. And so variational autoencoders can never do that. By design, by structure, it is never going to be able to exactly reproduce its input because of this sampling. Well, I never say never, because it's statistically possible that all your sampling lines up so that somehow you randomly manage to hit that 1 in a trillion spot, but there's nothing to it. So what the encoder learns is that it learns to generate these means for all the different classes within the input data, and then it clusters them, and then it minimizes the standard deviation so that these encodings are not too different from each other. Okay, so now this creates a slight problem, right? So generally what we want is that the means, these are the means, these dots, and the standard deviation represents how spread apart all of these are, right? So this is what we want from the input. But in general, what we may end up with is something like this. Because we are not checking whether these input values are close to each other in latent space, the model doesn't care. The model doesn't care how close these input representations are to each other. So that when we end up sampling, we might end up nowhere. You understand the challenge here? So this would be ideal. If we could get this every time, this would be ideal. So that when we are sampling, when we are picking random points from this latent representation, we are almost certain to hit within this distribution itself. But because the model doesn't know that we want something like this, what it ends up encoding is something like this, where they're spread apart arbitrarily within the latent space. Because this has no meaning, right? The only meaning the model knows are this mean and the standard deviation. The difference is divergence has no meaning to the model, so it places them arbitrarily within the latent space itself. And so when we sample, we end up getting nowhere, right? How do we solve this? We use something called the Kullback-Leibler divergence. I'm not going to talk about how this came about, but this isn't that complicated. This is simply a sampling technique. So what this does is that when you are sampling between two different positions, when we use the KL divergence as a metric to train this autoencoder, it minimizes the difference. So it minimizes this interclusteral difference within the latent space. So that's what the KL divergence does. So to make sure that all of these means and standard deviation are close together, this KL divergence term is added into what you know as the loss function, right? So what does this KL Kullback-Leibler divergence? What this measures is that between two different probability distributions that you saw in this previous slide. It measures how much they diverge from each other, right? And then you try to minimize it. If any of you have learned the optimal transport problem in your statistics classes, this is an example of a solution of the optimal transport problem, the KL divergence. And so what this ends up doing is that because you minimize this over and over in your runs, the parameters of the final distribution, the mu and sigma, it closely resembles the parameters of the target distribution. We add this scale divergence term that you see here, which is Q of Z given X, given a probability of Z or Z. We add this to the standard VAE loss term, the standard variational autoencoder loss term, which is this. This is the standard log loss system that you know, because this is a very simple log loss, right? Log loss P of theta of X given Z. That's a very basic log loss function that you have. And so we add this to put that like the divergence to the standard VAE loss, and then we try to minimize this. Right? We try to minimize this cross-entropic loss, cross-entropic log loss of the VAE. And once we have minimized it, we need another trick called the reparameterization trick, right? So let me see if I can move the mouse here. You see this. You see this is where you take the mu and the sigma of the probability and the summation of the input of the encoder, and this is. This mouse is so hard to see. Okay, so this is your input data that's coming in, right? And then your encoder is splitting out this mu and this sigma, which is essentially the mean and the standard deviation of the distribution that is eventually being sent to the latent space, and that latent space is being sampled by the decoder to get your final output, right? So what the reparameterization trick does is that this process of sampling is okay. Yeah, I was wondering why it's not coming. So it changes this process of sampling, right? So it samples from this mean and this standard deviation separately, right? So so we rewrite our implementation of this Gaussian sampling, and we take this random sampling as a noise, and we add that noise to the input. So what this essentially does is you see that this is the standard variational autoencoder input versus output. Takes the input, creates mean and standard deviation, it samples from it, goes to the decoder. What we do here is that we take what the reparameterization trick does is that it takes this goes as normal, takes the mean and the standard deviation, and then it uses this mean and standard deviation as a loss term, and then it adds that loss term as a random noise term to the representation of the decoder, which is then sampled. Right. So what this reparameterization trick does is that it adds this rand. You'll see that I've added this as a task in your homework, where you can change, instead of adding this sampling as a random noise term, what happens if you add something else? What happens if you add a constant noise value to this reparameterization trick? What happens to the output? What does it change? Does it improve? What happens? Now, what happens without this reparameterization trick at all is that when you are sampling, the randomness becomes constant, because your initial randomness, this original latent space that you're trying to create, remains fixed for the input data. Now, if you add in the sampling as a noise term to your this mean and standard deviation as a noise term to your sampling, you add in an extra bit of randomness to this that solves the problem of being stuck, essentially. Wait, I thought I had this slide. So this noise term that we're creating is independent, right? And it gives us an independent control of how the VA is performing that we can modify without modifying the input data itself. This is what the variational autoencoder latent space eventually looks like. So this is a standard MNIST data set, which is handwritten digits. This is what those handwritten digits 1, 2, 3, etc. look like in latent space. So you can see 1 is up top on the lighter color, 2 is at the bottom in the purplish color, but there is a very smooth interpolation between those two things, right? Because we have used the pullback, the KL divergence to bring our distributions closer together, and we've used the reparameterization trick to make sure there isn't that we haven't lost any of the randomness. What this means is that you can smoothly move from one letter to another. So when a person writes letters or digits or whatever, we are not machines, right? So our numbers and our letters are not perfect. And this imperfectness is captured within this VAE latent space. Right. So you can see between 1 and 2, it creates something that's closer to both 1 and 2, and it's able to classify it correctly. So when you're writing, it's able to more easily identify what you have written, even if it is slightly far from its input trading. And this is after doing the KL divergence, after doing the reparameterization trick, this is what your latent space is going to look like. Now, this is just for images. This also works for sentences, right? For natural language processing. So you can see that these are examples of VAE generated, variational autoencoder generated text. So you can see that between random points within the variational autoencoder space are words which are clustered together. And you can see that this mostly makes sense, right? Like none of these sentences are grammatically wrong because it has learned how humans write sentences, and it has learned how to recreate those sentences exactly. Right. So the top and the bottom is the top is the input, the bottom is the output, and in between are what the VAE has generated. So you can see the sentences that it has generated kind of make sense. So it is able to interpolate not just between images or points on a graph, it is also able to interpolate between word embeddings, and it is able to create textual information. Modern large language models, ChatGPT or whatever, it does this much better, but that uses a completely different structure. We won't talk about it today, but autoencoders were one of the first to do this, to do what's called semantic matching and do this kind of interpolation between sentences. So this is the last slide. I'm not doing anything else after this. So generally speaking, a perfectly trained, a well-trained, not a perfectly trained, but a well-trained variational autoencoder will have a very slow but non-zero K return and a very small cross-entropy term. You'll see that in your homework assignment. And if you directly implement it, the KL term generally overtrains itself and it drops to 0. And there are problems based on this. So we solve it by a variation of different methods. Cost annealing is probably the simplest method of doing this, but annealing doesn't always work for certain types of data that you don't have to care about. But generally, if you want to avoid your KL divergence term dropping to 0 after you have trained it for like about 10,000 times, annealing is a really good strategy. And there are other considerations for this. So you sample whatever you're sampling from the mean and standard deviation, you add it as an input to every cell in the decoder, and then you increase the word dropout probability. You can add regularization, et cetera, and all of these come into to give you better variational autoencoder losses. So these are optimal situations for word summaries, and you can see that KL losses, like all the different losses within PAs, this is what they end up looking like. Okay. That's it for today. I skipped over some of the stuff because it was getting more too technical, too boring. But if you're interested, this slide will be uploaded onto your Teams, and you can ask me questions. I